I'd like to begin by thanking all of you who are here, who are attending in attendance today. I'd like to thank certainly the organizers of this symposium, of which I happen to be one, but nonetheless, I thank everyone else who was involved in the organization, and especially I'd like to thank Lisa Jorgensen, who is the coordinator of the symposium this year. I will be introducing our guest, Charmaine Nelson, in just a moment. I'd just like to make a few preliminary comments. I'd like to begin by pointing out that today we're going to be dealing with a topic that relates to something called colonialism. Well, it relates to a facet of colonialism and imperialism. And it's that facet of colonialism and imperialism that entailed the forced transportation of humans from their ancestral homes in Africa on an unimaginable scale to what we know as the Americas. That process, which is part of a wider process of colonialism starting in the 16th century or so. So we're going to be speaking about that one, the one that the process that entailed the forced transportation of Africans to the Americas. Now that facet of colonialism entailed an additional or another facet, and that was the colonization and the settlement of the Americas, and in conjunction with that, the displacement and dispossession of indigenous peoples. So what we're looking at in these two connected facets of colonialism are two kind of world historical injustices, one of which is enslavement and the other of which is the dispossession of the indigenous peoples of the Americas. So in light of the fact that colonialism entailed that phenomenon, we should remember and we should recognize that this institution, Vanier College here in Ville-Saint-Laurent, and all of us as residents of Montreal inhabit what were once indigenous lands. Okay, and indigenous lands on which indigenous people lived for as much as millennia, and they were lands that were never ceded. So we must remember and recognize that fact. We use this land. We live on this land, and we occupy it with our institutions and so on. I'm really honored to be able to introduce now Charmaine Nelson and to her about her work today. Charmaine Nelson is a professor of art history. She was recently appointed as Tier 1 Canada Research Chair in Transatlantic Black Diasporic Art and Community Engagement at the Nova Scotia College of Art and Design in Halifax, Nova Scotia. Prior to taking up this post at NSCAD, she taught at McGill University for 7 years. In addition to commencing her appointment as the Canada Research Chair at NSCAD, she's also become, in conjunction with that, she's become the founding director of the first ever Institute for the Study of Canadian Slavery. Her research and writing focuses on transatlantic slavery, and especially on the often overlooked way that Canada was incorporated into that hemispheric system of labor transfer. Significantly, her work on the slave trade has focused on the function and place of visual representation in the maintenance of the ideological apparatus of slavery. Her recent research has focused on Canadian fugitive slave advertisements. I won't say too much more about that. I think we'll probably be talking about that a bit later in the discussion. I just want to mention some of her many publications, and specifically the single authored monographs, of which there are 3. The first being The Color of Stone, Sculpting the Black Female Subject in 19th Century America. Second, Representing the Black Female Subject in Western Art. And third, the 2016 publication, Slavery, Geography, and Empire in 19th Century Marine Landscapes of Montreal and Jamaica. And it is specifically with that last work that I think we're going to be engaging most of all. So I'd like to start the conversation. I guess the conversation will go somewhat like, I think it's in general orientation, something like from the general to the specific, maybe we could say from the macro to the micro, but we'd like to start with a question that relates to the phenomenon of slavery and transatlantic slavery at a kind of global level. I'd like to just preface this question by noting that in the book Slavery, Geography, and Empire, interestingly, it starts, the first sentence, in fact, of the book starts with a quote from Toni Morrison, in which she says that, slavery broke the world. She says broke the world in half, if I recall correctly. I found that to be quite a powerful statement. You know, in those few words, it says so much about how the world was changed as a result of transatlantic slavery. But it reminded me of something that I had read in a book called Racial Formation in the United States by Omi and Wynant. This was two sociologists who published what they call the theory of racial formation in the 80s. And they said something similar. They said also that the transatlantic slave trade, along with the arrival of Columbus in the Americas, were world shaping and world transforming. They say that these are both acts of what they call race making. And they say that the Columbus arrival and the conquest of America and the transatlantic slave trade gave rise to the modern world. They made up people in certain terms, and in fact constituted, and they use it that way, they say it constituted the modern world. So the slave trade is something of a world historical process. And that's where I would like to start today's conversation, Charmaine, is if you could talk to us in a general way about what the transatlantic slave trade, what was entailed in the transatlantic slave trade, what is it that we were talking about when we address ourselves to that. And then we'll move from there to talk more specifically about slavery and enslavement in Canada and Quebec. But if we could start there, I think that would be a good place.
For sure. Thank you, Brian. And I just wanted to say briefly, thank you also to Lisa, to Brian, and all the other organizers and the tech support for having me back to Vandy. It's a pleasure to be with you. And I'll just throw out there that actually, Brian, I was at McGill for 17 years, not 7.
Oh, sorry.
No problem. I just don't want to erase any of it because it was difficult. Okay. So, and that actually connects to what we're talking about in ways which people might not understand. But yeah, I love where you wanted to start here, because I think a lot of people who do not have a background in transatlantic slavery or Canadian slavery, which is most of us in Canada, don't understand how world transforming it is. So thank you for starting there. So if we think about it this way, when we're talking about transatlantic slavery, okay, not slavery that transpired prior to that or after, so not things like ancient slavery, let's say in ancient Rome, or modern sex trafficking, we're talking about a 400-year institution, it's referred to in the literature. And it went from the 1400s until the 1800s, and it extended from Argentina to Canada, including in the Americas, the Caribbean. And we have to remember too, when we think of where extracted or expropriated Africans were taken to or forced to go with their slave owners, that also meant that some of them were forced to accompany their slave owners back to Europe, which is something we don't often talk about. Okay, so we're talking about the scale of horror here. We know that 12 million Black Africans survived what is called the Middle Passage. And that is the territorial space of the Atlantic Ocean between the west coast of Africa and the coast of the Americas. So that's the space of the ocean through which the slave ships traveled, okay, the Middle Passage. But the Middle Passage for Blacks in diaspora is also an unmarked grave, because we know that 2 million of our ancestors died before reaching the Americas and were disposed of in the ocean. And that's the topic of the recent docuseries called Enslaved that's been broadcasting on CBC, the 2 million who never made it to the Americas. So we're focusing, though, most scholars focus on the 12 million who survived to go on to have subsequent generations to develop what we call the Black diaspora then in the Americas. Now, what people need to understand is why transatlantic slavery was so extraordinary, Brian, of course, is because, as you articulated, it was the first moment when human beings articulated something that they believed to be biological difference between people, which they called race. So that is where whiteness, Blackness, Asianness, Arabness was constituted as a supposedly biological category of human difference. And why it was constituted, we need to understand, in part was to justify a hierarchy of race, wherein Europeans always put themselves at the top of the so-called tree of man, and who was always at the bottom were Black Africans. And then Asians, Arabs, Indigenous people were somewhere in the middle between whiteness and Blackness. So how this plays out, of course, is that the only group in transatlantic slavery who are always deemed to be enslavable, if you will, were Black Africans. In some regions, indigenous people were enslaved. They were always being colonized, which of course is horrible. But it's Black Africans who were the group that were always deemed to be enslavable. Okay, and it's that 12 million group of 12 million then who survived to arrive that we're dealing with in terms of who becomes the enslaved after multiple generations. The other thing I want to point out too is slavery, people don't realize, today people talk about globalization as if it just happened in the 20th century. Slavery actually is a first act of early modern capitalist globalization. It is a birth of modern capitalism, but it's a birth of capitalism, of course, without a conscience, because a dominant object that's being sold and exchanged are human beings who are reduced to the status of chattel, meaning, and people need to understand this, movable personal property. That is what you considered. If you were an enslaved person under the law, you were considered movable personal property. You were not considered to be a human being. So this is why, of course, when you think about the geographical scope, Brian, slavery must be acknowledged as a 400-year Holocaust, right? A 400-year succession of multiplying atrocities that impact us across multiple races and multiple ethnicities. So when people want to dismiss it as a Black history, and that's one of the ways it gets dismissed, because of course, Black people are always marginalized in various European and Western contexts because of knock-on effects of slavery. But slavery is a white history, it's a Black history, it's an Asian history, it's an indigenous history, and so on, because of who were the different actors or groups of people who were impacted within it or who were acting within it.
Okay, thank you for that, Charmaine. Now, one facet, I guess, which is particularly relevant to Canada, Quebec, and Montreal of the slave institution, transatlantic slavery, that's often left out of the story of slavery, even from the Canadian standpoint, is the way in which Canada, Quebec, Montreal were incorporated into that system of labor, of forced labor transfer, and the concomitant transfer of goods and so on. Now, your work has been focused on trying to bring that facet of process to greater awareness. I think people in Canada and in Quebec have some knowledge of the fact that there was enslavement and specifically enslavement of Africans. Some do have some awareness of that, but what they're often not aware of is the way in which Canada was in fact incorporated into the transatlantic system of, one of the things that you point out is that we have to think about a possible second Middle Passage you refer to. And I found this really compelling and very interesting, is the connections between the Caribbean, for instance, or the West Indies and Canada during the slave period, and how if we think about Canada's place in that system, we kind of change the narrative about Canada and about Quebec, Canada, Montreal, and as well, and the role of slavery and enslavement. So I'd like you to talk a bit more about that, about how Canada fits into that wider structure of labor transfer, transportation, and what life was like for those who were slaves in Quebec and in Montreal in particular.
For sure. Thank you for that, Brian. So, okay. So if we remember again that slavery, transatlantic slavery, is occurring for 400 years between the 1400s and 1800s, then when we talk about Canada in terms of when Canada was colonized and when Black Africans started to arrive in Canada, we're talking about slavery transpiring across 200 of those years from the 1600s until 1834. Now, something else we have to clear up right away is we have this idea either that slavery never happened in Canada, which is just a lie, or that it was somehow kinder and gentler. So we're going to have to deal with that at a certain moment too. But Canadian slavery ends in 1834, not because slave owners in Canada were more benevolent and said, hey, let's stop doing this. It ended because there was an act of parliament passed in London, England, that forced slave owners everywhere in the British Empire to stop slaving. So we have to understand then we were a part of the British Empire. We remained loyal to them during the American Revolutionary War. So then we were still a British territory and we were forced to stop slave trading in 1834. Now, when we talk about, I wanted to create that idea of the second Middle Passage, Brian, the reason why that was so important, we have to understand that there was an extraordinary diversity of Black enslaved people living in Canada. Because here's the thing, the term Black, like the term white, it actually erases or hides the heterogeneity of the population you're talking about. If I say that someone is white, you don't know what their ethnicity is, you don't know where they're born or where they're living, for instance. Similarly with the term Black. So what do we mean by Black enslaved population in Canada? There would have been African Canadians, enslaved people who came to be born in Canada, African Americans, African Caribbeans, and probably African Creoles, we call people who were born in other regions of the Americas, and African-born people. Now, that's a flag. Why? The African-born people, we understand that in a place like Canada, slave ships did not arrive directly from Africa to Canada, okay? They would have disembarked someplace further south first, like a Jamaica, a Haiti, a South Carolina, even a New York City. Slave ships did arrive in a place like New York City directly from Africa, not in Canada. So if you find an African-born person living in Canada, you have to understand that that person would have survived probably at least 2 ships, a slave ship travels, okay? 2 voyages on a slave ship. So we have to start to reconceive or conceptualize then, what were those secondary voyages like? Where, and here's a trick, and the horror. On the initial slave ship voyages, the primary so-called cargo on the ship in the cargo hold were enslaved people, the enslaved Africans. And they were documented as such, usually not as a name, but as how many men, women, girls, and boys were on the ship. Okay, because again, you were considered to be an object, a part of the cargo, and there was insurance value on your head. So that if you died during the voyage, the slave ship captain and slave ship owner could recuperate their money, the money that they lost from not being able to sell you in the Americas. This is the horror of the objectification of enslaved people. Now, on a ship that's, say, traveling from Jamaica to Halifax, Nova Scotia, the primary cargo is the rum, sugar, molasses, coffee that enslaved people have been forced to produce in a place like Jamaica. The secondary cargo would have been enslaved people, 5, 10, 15, who get plucked out of Jamaica and forced to go to a place like Halifax. We have not even begun, Brian, to research what those merchant ships, right, what the conditions of those ships would have been like for enslaved people who were outnumbered then, were the secondary cargo on those ships. So we have to begin to think through that. Now, when we think about slavery in Canada, what are we dealing with? We're dealing with the provinces of Ontario eastward, in terms of when Canada was colonized, that the West was colonized last or later, okay? So we're dealing with slavery in Ontario, Quebec, New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, Prince Edward Island, Newfoundland, okay? All of those provinces or regions practice transatlantic slavery, all right? Now, the thing we have to understand about Canadian slavery too, it really, when you study it, it explodes some of the myths that we have about slavery in general. For instance, of course, although there was farming and large-scale farming sometimes in Canada, because of the seasonal shifts in the cold weather winters, farmers, or in Nova Scotia, there are men here that call themselves planters because originally they came from places like Maryland and Virginia and further south, but they could not sustain an all-year agricultural system because of the weather. So for instance, in Canada, you'll find smaller numbers of enslaved people. That does not mean they were treated any better. That means there were fewer of them. Now, the other thing that meant that because enslaved people couldn't be forced to work all year in agriculture, many of them we know were forced to do whatever the slave owner wanted them to do. So they're doing a combination often of domestic labor and outdoor labor, often agricultural. The other thing that we have to understand is often there were fewer enslaved people per household, 1 or 2. And that meant then that we have to take into factor in terms of their suffering, the nature of isolation from self and community. So what did it mean if an African-born person somehow ends up in Quebec City, as did the enslaved man named Joe, who was owned by the owner of the Quebec Gazette newspaper named William Brown? What was Joe's ethnicity? Was he able to find anybody else who spoke and remembered his African languages? Was he able to practice his culture? That is something we have to consider in terms of the isolation of self, I would argue, as a form of trauma. The other thing, Brian, before I stop there, is when we think about slavery in Canada, for instance, in a place like Jamaica, the majority of the enslaved people are living in the countryside because they're working on the plantations. When we switch it up and think about slavery in Canada, it was dominantly urban. So in a place like Quebec, because of the wonderful research of someone like Frank Mackey, we know that the majority of enslaved people lived in Quebec City, and then in Montreal, and then in the rest of the province. In a place like Nova Scotia, the majority of enslaved people would have been forced to live in Halifax. So it's the reverse of the tropical places, where the majority of enslaved are being forced out into the countryside because they're forced to work on plantations.
So I think it's kind of shocking to realize that there was enslavement in Montreal. When I was reading in preparation for this discussion previously, that there were slaves in Quebec, and that some African people were enslaved, or people of African descent were in slavery in Montreal as well. But what were the approximate numbers of people who were enslaved in Quebec? I don't know if we'd be able to kind of narrow it down to the numbers that were enslaved in Montreal, and who were the slave owners? I think you touched on this in your response to the previous question, but can we get perhaps a bit more of a detailed profile on what that was like in Montreal? I mean, this is where we live, and the reality of the fact that there were some people in Quebec who were the owners of other human beings is a kind of alarming and shocking fact about the history of this place. And I think it changes our perspective on this place and our understanding of the narrative, the historical narrative of Montreal, to be aware of that. You're right that often it is when slavery in Quebec, for instance, or in Canada is mentioned, there's a kind of a but that sometimes kicks in, right? Often it's always stated that this was a horrendous kind of relationship between human beings, and one in which the power differential was of the most extreme that we can, that exists among human beings, right? The slave-master relationship is the most extreme of power differential, of uneven differentials in power. And that happened in Montreal for a period of time until somewhere in the early part of the 19th century. But can we talk a bit more about that?
Sure.
And how that changes, how being aware of that kind of does and maybe should change the narrative about this, about the city, how we think about how we think about the city and our place in it at the present.
Absolutely. So to begin with, if we go back to the period when Quebec was at first called New France, colonized initially by the French, okay? We have to understand what was unique about New France / Quebec is that the French were enslaving, in this form of transatlantic slavery, chattel slavery, both Indigenous and Black people. Other places in Canada, it was mainly Black people or only Black people. And for the most part across the Americas, again, the dominant population who was always deemed to be enslavable were Black Africans. So you have at different moments, different monarchies actually, quote unquote, protecting the Indigenous people. Not really, of course, because they gave the green light to colonization, but they say, hold up a second, that population should not be enslaved. They're closer to us, meaning whiteness, than Black people. Okay, so we have to understand that it's actually extraordinary that the French were actually enslaving both Indigenous and Black people in New France. Now, what is also extraordinary is when the British show up and we have conquest in 1760, the British, who are not enslaving Indigenous people in other regions of the British Empire, take up the French practice and continue to enslave both Indigenous and Black people. And in the Treaty of Capitulation, they actually specify that the French citizens who remain behind in what they renamed Quebec are allowed to keep their slaves. So another thing we have to debunk is that different empires, different European nations were always warring with each other. When it came to slavery, they all agreed that it was a good thing. And they would work to actually prop up the ability and the right of other empires to continue to slave. And there's a perfect example of that. So the other thing in terms of that question about population size, so in general, it's quite hard to determine such things, in part because early census records for different Canadian provinces are spotty to non-existent. But thanks to the brilliant research of Canadian slavery studies scholar Marcel Trudel, who used to teach at Laval and Ottawa U, Trudel determined that there were probably around 3,600 enslaved people of both Indigenous and African descent, meaning Black, living in New France at the point it was transitioning to being Quebec. That's 1759. So, and of that population, 2/3 he predicted would have been Indigenous, and 1/3 would have been Black. So the Black population were the smaller population of enslaved people at that time. In terms of who owned slave, this is another myth buster. When we look at Hollywood film like 12 Years a Slave or Django Unchained, we're taught to think only of the planter, the plantation owner, who was of course rich, wealthy, and a white man. So right away we have to understand too that white women also owned enslaved people, often on their own, or of course as the spouse of a husband who also owned enslaved people, or as a widow. So we can't exclude them from these conversations. And we also want to think about the fact that in Canada, there are many middle or even lower middle class people who own slaves. So you'll find in the archives sources that say butchers and tailors, for instance, and common merchants owned enslaved people. Also, you have the rich people, like the governor would own enslaved people, and a very famous James McGill, who was, here's the thing with McGill. We're taught to only talk about him as a fur trader. That's a lie. James McGill also made a lot of his incredible wealth by being what was called in the 18th century a West Indian merchant, which means that when we talk about the slave ship transits, Ryan, of the ships going between, let's say, Halifax and Jamaica, James McGill was working ships, merchant ships between Montreal and English colonized Caribbean islands like Jamaica, Barbados, etc., to bring in what? Shipments of rum, sugar, molasses, which he was selling, of course, in the province of Quebec. So not only was he a slave owner in Quebec, he owned at least 5 different Indigenous and Black people across his lifetime. He also was profiting from the forced labor of the enslaved in the Caribbean as well. So we have the spectrum of slave owning across, of course, sex, men and women, but of course across class, which is something too that Canadians don't understand, because we like to relegate it then as the problem of the wealthy, right? And as the fault then of the wealthy.
Yeah, it's really remarkable to take account of that, of those relationships between the Caribbean and Montreal, and to be aware of the fact that Canada and Montreal, as an important port city on the northeastern coast of North America, was in fact involved and incorporated into that system that was that was so consequential for the world, and particularly consequential for Africans. You spoke earlier on, you mentioned something about the relationship between conception of human beings in which race is at the center, okay, organizing or thinking about human beings in terms of a kind of a hierarchical arrangement of human beings, categorized or classified in terms of race. Okay, that manner of thinking about human beings was intimately linked and intersected with the transatlantic slave trade as, I guess, a kind of a support, an ideological support, perhaps, or a rationalization for that system of, that entailed some human beings owning other human beings. Can you talk a bit more about the relationship between that outlook, that perspective on human beings, thinking about human beings in those terms and their differences in those terms, and the maintenance of that system of labor transfer and settlement of the Americas in particular?
Absolutely. Okay, what a great question. All right, so, and I think I didn't answer your other question before too. You said, what does it mean to us today? So I'll try to get to that too, in terms of slavery being practiced in Montreal and Quebec. So one of the things I think that helps us to understand, and for me to answer your question, Brian, is the fact that people also don't understand what is uniquely horrific about transatlantic slavery is the fact that slave owners deliberately organized it in what we could call a matrilineal order, meaning that any child born to an enslaved female, regardless of the status or the race of the father, was immediately an enslaved person, a slave, owned by the person who owned her. So what this did was incentivize rape and sexual coercion. And it's a very difficult topic, but you cannot not talk about this topic because this was at the heart of slavery. And what this opened up was a plethora of horrors then for enslaved community. So you can imagine then, if rape and sexual coercion is ubiquitous, it's everywhere. This is where we get then the explosion in the mixed race enslaved population, meaning part white, part black. Why? Because so many enslaved children are born to white slave owning fathers. So the owner of the female is raping her and sexual coercing her. And then she has, by the terminology of the day, the horrible racist terminology, a mulatto child. But that child is still considered to be not the child, the legitimized child of that white slave owner is considered to be another object, another slave that he owned. And many, many white fathers did not free their children and didn't see them as their children. They saw them as a byproduct of the slaving system and just another unit of labor that they owned along with the woman. At the same time, what this did then, you can imagine being Black enslaved men who are witnessing this daily and unable to intervene in any way to help or protect their female kin without themselves putting their lives on the line. Because we know that corporal punishment was used not just to maim and to harm and to mark enslaved people's bodies, but to outright kill them, and to kill them in spectacular ways that would make examples of their deaths, right? Or examples of them as resisting, so that it would deter resistance in the rest of the population. So this is why, too, you can connect this to other practices in slavery. This is why you have, in general, one of the reasons, when you look at fugitive or runaway slave ads, there's majority of the people running away are enslaved men alone. And it's not that they don't love their family, it's not that they don't love their communities or the woman they consider to be their wives or their children, but they will leave them behind in part because it's too psychologically horrifying for them to be in the presence of the constant rape and abuse of their family and not be able to stop it. Because part of what slavery did was then, and here's the complexity, at the same time that you're hypersexualizing the population, right? Because you don't take responsibility as the white slave owning classes for the fact that you are raping, right, and forcing sex onto the female population. You actually justify that through the stereotyping of Black sexuality as aberrant, right? And that's where you get the stereotypes of Blackness and Black sexuality as being different, deviant, excessive, right? Those are parts of the let's say stereotyping of Blackness that have to be mobilized to justify this horrific treatment. So on the one hand, you are trying to infantilize Black men all the time, right? So you see in a movie like 12 Years a Slave, this is very true to fact, that Northup is whose name is transformed to Platt under the burden of slavery. He's a free Black man who gets kidnapped into slavery. His slave owners will constantly, this is a grown-ass man, the slave owners constantly call him boy, right? So you do that to disempower Black men at the same time that you as a white males in that society are taking advantage of the Black women who you hypersexualize, and you actually, you put into place practices that accelerate their progress from girl to womanhood to justify the sexual coercion that you force upon them. So for instance, how does this manifest? In slave sale ads, in slave fugitive ads where women are listed often, people who are considered to be girls at the time are called wench or referred to as a negress, as a grown Black woman. Although they're 15 or 14. And at the time, you would refer to a white girl as a girl, but refer to the Black girl as a woman or a wench. And a wench, we have to understand, is a specific 18th century word that meant a woman of loose sexual morality. So to your point then, this racialization rationalization, or what we could also call justification, underpinned every facet of society. There's cultural justifications that are produced in literature or in art. And we have to understand, in the 400 years of slavery, okay, as an art historian, my way into this conversation is understanding that there's a 400-year archive of art and visual culture that was produced to justify slavery that we call pro-slavery. And of course, too, there's anti-slavery people come along and go, we can use art too to tell people that it's wrong and to incentivize them to stop participating in it, right? So the abolitionists were extraordinary at using especially popular visual culture like prints, okay, that predated, of course, photography. But in terms of your previous question, what does it mean to us today? Listen, our nation was founded on anti-Black, anti-Indigenous racism. Do we get that as a nation? No, we don't. Because what we usually do this month in February is talk about ourselves as abolitionists, period. We like to talk about the Underground Railroad, which we have to understand, people, was 31 years. 31 years. From 1834, when the British abolished slavery, to the end of the American Civil War. That is a period when African-American enslaved people are fleeing north into Canada, because they understand crossing that border is to cross into a free state. Okay, pre-1834, you have enslaved people running back and forth across the Canada-US border, because their whole objective is just get me away from my slave owner. Get me the heck away from him or her, and let me be able to have a chance to pass myself off as a free person, right? But who wants to talk about that in Canada? Do we want to talk about the fact that enslaved Black people were running south to get away from white Canadian slave owners? Who wants to talk about that? Nobody, right? Because it doesn't make us look good. It doesn't make us feel good. It doesn't buy into our narrative of being a race-blind, racially tolerant nation. But of course we are not, right? That's why the racial injustices now that are being spotlighted, thankfully, by Black Lives Matter, that are ongoing in Canada against Black and Indigenous and other people of color in this nation, are not new. They're a transformation of they're a legacy of transatlantic slavery in terms of the expendability of certain populations and not others.
Yeah, I think that this is important in as much as there's an ongoing debate. Certainly, I think it's manifested in Canada in a different kind of way than it is in the United States about what the relevance is of the transatlantic slave period to the contemporary struggles and the contemporary mobilization, political mobilizations around questions of race and racial injustice, right? I think there's certainly debates that pit, okay, there's always the right will always take a particular view about, what the relevance might be of the slave period on the contemporary circumstances of Black Americans, for instance. And okay, so that's an ongoing debate. But I think you also have a discussion, and I think an interesting discussion at times among Black Americans, maybe among Black Canadians as well to some extent, about the significance of the slave period to the contemporary circumstances of Blacks in the United States and Canada, and also their ongoing political, as I said, political mobilizations for justice and so on. So, yeah, I think we have to. It's important to try to come to grips with why it's relevant to think about the slave period, to understand that, to incorporate it into our historical understanding of the circumstances of Blacks in the present time. So, yeah, so thanks for that answer. I don't know if there's something else that we want to kind of contribute to that, or if we want to add to that.
I think I would just chime in, Brian, and say that what people don't understand then, okay, so first of all, we have a habit in Canada of either denying that slavery happened at all, 200-year history. We want to just enshrine and celebrate the 31-year history, but we just want to obliterate the 200-year history. When we acknowledge that slavery happened here, the first place most people go is it must have been kinder and gentler because there were fewer enslaved people. And I'm like, how did you come up with that? What fantasy world are you living in? How does fewer people mean they were treated better? Right? So it's in the myth of the benevolent white Canadian slave owner. Okay, so that too has to be debunked. The other thing that people don't understand is when slavery ends, listen, do you think slave owners want to give that up? Does anybody think that slave owners want to give up their ability to own people? Here's the thing too, the British Empire actually paid out slave owners who lived in tropical locations like Jamaica for every so-called head of Negro that they lost. They paid them for the property they lost. The enslaved people got this. Do you understand me? That's what we need to deal with too, the understanding the justice of that. But here's the thing. When slavery ends, racism doesn't end. The institution of slavery is gone, but slave owners, other colonialists, other white people who are invested in the notion of themselves as being superior to Blacks and Indigenous people and everybody else, they shapeshift that into different institutions, like policing, like the government, right? Like medical, the medical infrastructure, right? And we see that today, for instance, who's dying of COVID more, right? And this is very complex, but part of it is that it's more likely that Black populations will be lower class, in part because of racism in education, right? So people not accessing that education, so they end up with a job that pays them less. They end up with an hourly wage that has not sufficient vacation pay. They end up with a job that's public facing, so they're exposed to more people, which means they could get COVID more easily. And then if you're in a place like the USA, that also means you don't have universal health care, which means what? When you catch COVID, good luck to you in getting proper treatment. Whereas Donald Trump and Boris Johnson get it, and they get like drugs that haven't even been approved yet, right? So this is what we have to understand too, that slavery ends and racism does not end. It transforms. It just shapeshifts. And so our ignorance in tackling it is in part because if for 400 years, slave owners and their surrogates were working hard to justify, to institutionalize, to build infrastructures that were race-based, that dehumanized and animalized Black people, how hard have we been working since the 1800s to undo all that, right? Most white people have been ignoring it and pretending that everything became equal at the point of abolition, which is rubbish. So how much work has to go into undoing 400 years of that horror? And are we doing it? In Canada, we're certainly not, because we haven't even acknowledged that it ever happened on any kind of nationwide scale. And what I mean by that too, Brian, is, for instance, you look at Canadian curriculum. When I teach students about slavery, when I've taught them in the past at McGill, I always ask them, how many of you come to my class knowing that slavery happened in Canada? In my 20 years of teaching, because I taught at Western for 2 years, then at McGill for 17, now I'm at NASCAD, I've had one Canadian student tell me they were taught about Canadian slavery. And when I asked them, please share the content you received with the class, there was no content. The teacher gave them one sentence, slavery happened in Canada, and then proceeded to teach them about slavery in a tropical region. That's what we're up against. What the same students tell me they were taught from grade 2 in Canada about the Underground Railroad, about the 31-year history that makes us feel good, it makes us look good, it makes us look like the people who saved enslaved African Americans. So what do we do with that? You see how much work we have to do?
Yeah, well, you're doing that work. Right now, you're among the scholars who are doing that work. One of the interesting things, one of the interesting the angles of your work, among so much of it is interesting, but I think that your more recent work has been looking at, in some detail, at ads in newspapers. And the shocking thing, or the astounding thing to realize, is that in a newspaper like the Montreal Gazette, which many of us read on almost a daily basis, at one time, you had ads which were for the sale of human beings. Mm-hmm. Okay, for the sale and purchase of human beings. Mm-hmm. I think mostly of African descent. I don't know if Indigenous people were also, or if there were ads that for the sale and purchase of Indigenous human beings, but mm-hmm. certainly for Africans. And then the other type of ads are those fugitive advertisements that you were relating to, or that you were referring to, that had to do with the recovery or the return of escaped or enslaved people who had left. And this was in the Montreal Gazette. And you've been working on those ads. I think maybe it would be interesting to kind of talk about that a bit more, because I think it emphasizes for us the reality of mm-hmm. slavery in the city in which we live.
Yes.
Right, and yes. the fact that you had those kinds of advertisements, right, that had to do with the purchase and sale of actual human beings by other human beings.
Yes.
In a newspaper like the Gazette. I'd like you to talk a bit more about mining that material, which I find absolutely fascinating. I'm someone who also loves to do archival work, and I appreciate that kind of excavation of material that you're doing now when you're looking at those kind of advertisements, and with an art historian's eye as well, and kind of getting out of that some very deep meanings about what enslavement meant for the individuals who in fact were enslaved. And I guess that leads into an additional question that I would like to ask you to address, and that is, what does it feel like to do this kind of research? I know this doesn't seem like, it might seem like an inappropriate question for research of social scientific research, where we're supposed to conduct our work and do our writing at a kind of distance from our topic, from our subject, with what we would call a scientific kind of objectivity. I find it difficult to think about how one can be objective about the kinds of circumstances that you're investigating. And I have to say that in reading, in particular, the book on the maritime landscapes, one gets a sense in your style that you are conveying a sense of I don't know, I guess of how unjust this circumstance it was, and how unjust this dehumanizing circumstance was. At the same time as it's a scholarly work, one can sense an authorial standpoint, of that this was a terrible moment in the history of humanity, and it happens to be among the forms of human relationships that is the most demeaning to human beings. So what does it feel like to work on that? Can you maintain a distance? And how do you deal with the awareness that human beings do these kind of things to each other?
Right. Okay.
I'll just before you answer, I'll just want to say that if there are any questions, please send them in. Okay, and please go ahead, Charmaine, on that.
Fantastic. Thank you. Okay. Brilliant questions, of course. Okay, first about the newspapers. So if you go to colonial newspapers, so newspapers printed in the period of slavery, across the Americas where there was a printing press, you'll find newspapers that have dominantly three types of ads to do with slavery. That's slave sale ads and slave auction ads, where the enslaved person is being sold or auctioned, and what we call runaway or fugitive slave ads, where the owner of the enslaved person is printing an ad to try to recapture the person who's resisted through flight. And I should point out there were a myriad ways enslaved people were resisting, but one of the most kind of spectacular, obvious ways to resist was to try to run away, to physically remove yourself and claim your freedom by running away. Okay. Now, part of how we do this research, as Brian is so ably pointing out, is that sadly in Canada, okay, so what I've been pointing out throughout is Canadian slavery studies is a field, but there's right now probably 5 of us who have jobs at a Canadian or other university who are specialized in Canadian slavery enough to teach it at a university level, about 5 people. So the knock-on effect is how many people, MAs and PhDs, can I train in a career? And those other 5 people, for instance, in order to produce the next generation of scholars. So part of the problem of Canadian slavery studies is that our government and our academic landscape doesn't acknowledge it as a field worthy of hiring academics who could pass on this information and train people to do the research. Okay, it's a very specialized type of research. It's unlike studying or researching free people, because you're looking for completely different documents, because again, enslaved people were not considered human beings. They're considered chattel or movable personal property. So for instance, you're never looking for a birth certificate. Now, in places like Jamaica, Haiti, the US South, Brazil, slavery is so richly studied by such a huge diversity of disciplines, like biologists are studying it, anthropologists, historians, of course, art historians, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, that a lot of the data I'm talking about, a lot of the archival sources have already been digitized. They're online. You sit at home in your pajamas, you click the button, you look at your document. Not so in Canada. Much of it is still in archives, a lot of it in the provincial archives of each of the provinces I mentioned at the top. So you have to go there, and a lot of it, they'll never hand you the 18th century sheet of paper anymore. They have put it on microfilm reels that you feed into the microfilm reader. Some of the students may have used these already. Many students don't touch these things until they're doing grad studies. And it's painstaking, it's mind numbing. You have to be so alert because you'll miss something. But for instance, newspapers like the Halifax Gazette, the Montreal Gazette, the Quebec Gazette, usually in the 18th century, they're 3 or 4 pages long, but there's a succession of like all these different advertising announcements from the governor, blah, blah, blah. And mixed in with those are the slave and auction ads and the fugitive slave ads. So you have to go to the archive, you have to sit, you have to find them, you have to identify them, you have to digitize them if you want to do this work. That's what I had to do before I lived in Halifax. I took trips out here to work on Nova Scotia slavery. I went to the provincial archives, I digitized those documents myself. Okay. Now, the difference between sale and auction and the fugitive ads are really stunning. You might think, oh, they're all horrible. They're all trying to dehumanize the enslaved and keep them in bondage. But the slave and auction ads are, you know, what's noteworthy about them is how little information they gave, Brian. For instance, they almost never have the name of the person being sold. They'll just say, for instance, using the horrible racist terminology, Negro man for sale or will be auctioned at 5 o'clock from Robert Pierpoint's wharf, right? You know nothing about him. Sometimes they don't even put the age. Other times they'll put, whether it's a male or a female being auctioned, they'll put the age. Why would they put the age? Because you can imagine the mortality rates of enslaved people were far more horrible than free white people. So if you're an enslaved person in Montreal and you're 30 years old, you're old already. Right? That's another thing that Marcel Trudel did for us. He estimated mortality rates for 1759 for enslaved people. And he estimated that indigenous slaves were dying at the age of 17 and Black slaves at the age of 25. Okay, so what is adolescence when you die at 25? What is childhood when you die at 17? Right? These concepts are modern. They're contemporary concepts of human lifespan. Anyway. So the slave that auction ad will often say the age because they're trying to convey to you, you're going to get years more labor out of this person. They also often are really deceptive because they're always claiming that the enslaved person is obedient and healthy. And of course, that's impossible because many enslaved people were resistant and defiant, and many of them were ill, right? Or had been harmed through things like illness, corporal punishment, etc. So they're riddled with lies, but the drive behind that, of course, is I need to sell this person, I want to get my money. Now, with the fugitive ads, completely different. And to Brian's point, as an art historian, after reading a lot of these ads, I thought, what is going on in these ads? Like, how do they function? So the ads, of course, there's no photography didn't exist yet. Sometimes you get an icon in the corner of a man running, or really strange ones in Quebec, like that look like a little indigenous, a stereotypical indigenous figure. And in different regions, you have different types of icons. But the icon is a trigger to say, hey, reader, this is a fugitive ad, pay attention. This is about an enslaved person escaping, and I want your help to help me catch them. But the fugitive ads are full of, they're the opposite of the sale or auction ad. They're abundant description. You get a name, usually only a first name, because enslaved people's, the last name typically was the name of the person who owned them, because you strip the name of the enslaved person, right? Then you have a height, you have a body type, you have what they were wearing, right? You have mannerisms, you have languages, you have accents, you have the region they were taken from or lived in previously, where they were born. You have abundant detail. Why? Because how it functions, again, as an art historian, what was attractive to me about them, of trying to figure them out, is the ad could never work, right? It could never function as the slave owners intended, meaning to get the reader to read it and find the person, unless the textual description was translated into a visual one in the mind of the reader, right? You have to read that text. You have to go, okay, they said I'm hunting for Joe, and Joe is 5'8" and he's African born, which means he might be dark complexion. They're describing his hair. They're saying what coat he was wearing, blah, blah, blah. Let me see if oh, that guy could be Joe. Then you go try to catch him and put him in where? His Majesty's jail. But then the point is that for me, I have theorized that the fugitive slave ads were a form of unauthorized portraiture, but the portrait was the text. The portrait is visual in that it's a visual language that has to be translated into mental image in the mind of the reader for it to function. Okay, but the thing is then, those ads are so detailed that they actually undo the work of slavery, in that the slave owners were so desperate to recuperate their lost property that they would often detail things, Brian, that were not helpful to the idea that Black people or enslaved people were unsophisticated, uncivilized things. So for instance, if you mention the person has 4 languages, do they really need you to civilize them? If you mention the person plays the violin and is a great cook and is right, and all these different things. So often what is disclosed about the enslaved person fought against the idea of enslaved Black people as animals. And often too, the slave owners would detail, Brian, the nature of how the enslaved person escaped, which showed that there was forethought and sophisticated reasoning.
Yeah. Well, look, this is absolutely fascinating work. And it's remarkable that you can extract that much information about that historical period in Montreal from what are, yes, as you mentioned, kind of small, often just small ads. One thing I would like to add about the auction or sale ads is that often, and that astounded me when I was reading some of them as I was preparing for today's discussion, is that often the individual, the slave, or the sale of the individual will be mentioned alongside the sale of our objects and animals. I mean, that was also astounding to me. But more than anything, it's just realizing that that kind of activity was going on in a place like Montreal at one point in time, and that human beings were being used in that way, were being written about, thought about, talked about in that way. And then in a newspaper like the Montreal Gazette, the newspaper was being used to conduct commerce in human beings.
Yes,
it's a kind of an astounding thing to realize about the history of the place in which you live. And it's not a history that is widely known. There are a couple of questions that have come in that I think we can take because we're running too close to the end of our time. So I'm going to look at both of them. I'll read both of them out to you, and you can answer. I think you can answer both of them in one shot then. So the first, both are from colleagues of the Humanities Department. So one asks, says, do you think it's possible that the cultural amnesia of Canadian enslavement is also because we've wanted to distance ourselves from racial discrimination and instead have wanted a more equal society, or to create a Canadian identity that promotes equality? So I guess the point being made here is that the Canadian narrative about equality and inclusion and diversity and recognition and so on has in a way displaced or erased or marginalized the story of these moments, or these types of what was going on in this territory at one point in time. That doesn't support the that other narrative. And then the second question here says, well, amazing discussion. Thank you so much. Have we been able to trace the lineage in Montreal in order to contact or know of the descendants of enslaved Black people? That's great. Yeah, that's a good question. Very interesting one. Are we aware of those people who are the descendants of enslaved Blacks in Montreal from slavery in Montreal? If I'm not mistaken, it was so supposedly abolished or declared illegal somewhere around 1830s, right? Was that
1834?
1834.
Yeah.
There was a declaration to that effect. But there must be descendants of those people. And do we know anything about them?
Yes.
Or are we aware of them? So I'll leave you with those two questions.
Thank you. And so just briefly too, I want to say, Brian, to your point about newspapers, sometimes the connection between slavery and newspapers was even more direct. In the case of the Quebec Gazette, the two founders, Thomas Gilmore and William Brown, were slave owners. And one of the men, at least, that we know they enslaved, named Joe, known only as Joe, was forced to work in the printing office. Okay, so that's like, you don't get any closer than that. The other thing, sorry, I forgot to answer your brilliant question about what does it feel like to do the research. My ancestry is two Jamaican Canadian parents, so born in Jamaica, now Canadians, of course. But so I know if I go back a certain amount of generations, I hit enslaved people. There's no avoiding it, right? So for me, it is personal, and I don't try to pretend it's not. The other thing too is in my writing, I make the point of saying that for white and any other scholar of any race and ethnicity, research is always personal. You might try to hide that fact, but you're trying to hide that fact. How you make your decisions about what discipline you went into, what specializations, what objects you want to study and why, what questions you pose at the archive, they're all personal questions that can only come through your identity as a person of a certain race or ethnic background, a certain gender, a certain sexuality. So some of us, like declare that. Other people try to hide that, but all of it is personal. But to your point then, in terms of what it feels like, I try to then practice. It feels personal. It's very difficult at times, but I can separate the fact that my experience of it as difficult has nothing to do with the fact that, for instance, I never suffered it. I think some people get confused, and especially in today when we're very, and of course we should be conscious of students having different sensibilities and different traumas. So a lot of professors will give trigger warnings before they teach a certain class. When I teach about slavery, I say the whole semester is a trigger warning, and you as students have to make a decision on whether or not you can sit with this material. And personally, for me as a professor then, my advice is that I need you to feel, I want you to feel. If you read about slavery and the suffering of the enslaved and you don't feel anything, I'm worried about you as a human being. So if you're not crying at times, if you don't feel like you need a break at times, there's a problem and you shouldn't be taking the class. So I'm like the reverse, I think, of what a lot of professors would say in terms of objective distance, blah, 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 which I think is nonsense for this type of study. And now, brilliant question, cultural amnesia. Listen, I wouldn't argue against the fact that some Canadians, of course, the reason they want us to focus on the Underground Railroad as opposed to slavery is that they have good intentions in terms of saying, hey, what do we want to be as a nation? Do we want to be racially tolerant, inclusive, et cetera? But that's not how we do it. That's not how we get there. If we don't understand our history, we don't understand what's going on now, because our history is our present, right? And when we talk about slavery in the transatlantic world, and you talk about how many times you turn on the TV and it's a Black person, usually a Black man, who's being, hyper surveilled by the police, who is a victim of police brutality, who has died in police custody. It's not usually a white man, it's not usually a white woman, right? It's often not other groups of people of color. It's often Indigenous people and Black people. We have to understand where that comes from. We're not going to understand, again, the foundations of the nation as being built upon anti-Black and anti-Indigenous racism unless you understand that for 2 centuries we practiced slavery. So I think then, I agree with the person that why some people want to advocate for the study of, let's say, the Underground Railroad over slavery is that they want to build that inclusive future, but you don't do that by denying where we have come from. And actually it's an affront to us as Blacks in the diaspora, as Black Canadians who are still suffering the effects and the legacy of this, that our fellow Canadians refuse to acknowledge that we're having a separate experience of nation. That is very difficult for us because we're constantly put in the position to justify our experience. And our experiences are constantly, and our recitations of our experiences to other groups are constantly questioned, the validity of them and the objectivity of them. So that for us, at a certain point, we just stop talking to other groups of people. We just talk amongst ourselves because we understand that we get shut down often by our white peers, white colleagues, and white friends who refuse to understand the difference of our experience. The fact that, for instance, Brian, and you would know this, but many people of color, certainly Indigenous people, Black people, if you're a parent and as your kids are pre-teen, you sit them down and talk to them about what to do when the police come for them, which they will. How to identify yourself, how to say where you live, where to put your hands, not to have anything in your hands. Which white parent is having that conversation with their kids? Tell me. Which white parent feels they have to have that conversation with their kids? And if not, they're irresponsible as a parent, right? So let's get real about what the knock-on effects, what are we living with today because of what slavery did, right? And the legacies of that. In terms of the lineage, thank you for that, of Black descendants of slavery, absolutely. So here in Nova Scotia, can I tell you, African Canadians then, right? Those people descended from free and enslaved Blacks in the period of slavery, they know each other by last names, my friend. They can identify who is African Canadian, how many generations. If you're descended from the Loyalists or Loyalists from, let's say, the Revolutionary War compared to the Loyalists from the War of 1812, they know. They know. That would be the same for African Canadians in Quebec, for many in Ontario as well. So what we have to understand too is Blackness in Canada is still extremely diverse. But now what's happened is because of the immigration of many Black Caribbeans, like my parents in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, from the Franco and Anglo-Caribbean, so Haiti, Martinique, Guadeloupe, Jamaica, Barbados, etc. Black Caribbeans are the largest population of Black Canadians today, right? We've overtaken African Canadians as the biggest population. And then there's also continental Africans, people came straight from Africa to Canada more recently, and then more African Latinos, Black people from the Dominican Republic, Cuba, Venezuela, etc. Extraordinarily diverse. But for the African Canadians, many of them do know exactly how many generations they've been in the nation. They know how they got into the nation, and they know each other by name, especially in African Nova Scotians.
Fascinating, brilliant. Listen, there's two more questions.
Sure.
One of which I think you answered to some degree already, but there was a part of this question that maybe I'll mention to you, and you can address it. And it has to do with the possible continuity or between the fugitive ads and
Yes.
the searching for escaped slaves or former slaves and contemporary policing in the contemporary period. Is there some kind of rapport or relationship or continuity between that form of treatment, I guess, and what we know of in Canada and in the United States of the particular practices of policing with respect to Black populations? There's another question. Well, two more. We only have about 5 minutes, but we'll see. I'm just going to read the last two questions, and if people have to go at quarter to, they may, and we'll finish up with whomever's left. But okay, so another question here, I'll read it out. It says, as an art historian, can you discuss the value of art and visual culture to the study of history, especially history that has experienced erasure due to the legacy of colonialism and the present existence of racism? Yeah, very interesting, a good question, and interesting reference to your research and your examination of the kind of visual dimension of the slave period. Final, do you know of any other countries? Do you know how other countries teach the history of slavery? Like how this history is portrayed in Britain, for example? Okay.
Right. Okay, maybe I'll start with that one. Astoundingly, back in Britain, they're not teaching this history, and they somehow teach it as if they were not involved. So that blew my mind when people were telling me that, because I was like, they were the empire. How do they get away with that? So absolutely, Britain is guilty too of not teaching the history, or teaching it in selective ways that try to make them look like the good guys. And how they do it, though, is around the fact that in 1807, Brian, they abolished slave trading. So they said, okay, listen, everybody, stop going to Africa for more enslaved people. Now, if you want to have enslaved people, you have to make sure they procreate. So then, though, this was horrifying for enslaved people, because there was even more scrutiny and invasive action taken against especially enslaved females, but also enslaved males, in terms of their sexuality and their fertility. And that's where we have we had this before, prior to this, but then breeding gets accelerated, meaning that just like like the owners of a cow or a horse would try to breed the house horse or the cow, they use the same terminology for enslaved people and trying to force them to reproduce, either through white men getting access to enslaved women, or through Black people being forced to couple across the years of their fertility. Very difficult topic. We need to discuss it, okay? Now, fugitive slave ads, oh my gosh, completely connected to today. So think about it this way. The fugitive slave ad is pre-photography. Some places where slavery ends later, like USA, it ends in 1865, Brazil, 1888. They actually exist in the period of photography. In the USA, they start to use photos in the fugitive ads. Think of that. They start to actually reproduce photos in the ads. So here's the thing, my friends. Fugitive ads are the precursor to the mugshot. They're the precursor to the modern day mugshot. And when we think about in the media, it's only been, say, 10 years or less since white dominated media has started to say white criminal broke into the bank, he's white male, 5'6", brown hair. Before that, it was just a criminal. But when the criminal was a Black man or an Arab man or indigenous man, they'd say Black male on the run, 5'6", brown hair. So Blackness was constantly renamed and cited in conjunction with criminality in this nation and across the West in a way that whiteness never was, right? Because to be whiteness was just to be a human. So there we have to look too at the way popular culture, popular media like news media is also very guilty, not just two-dimensional forms, like the photographic mugshot taken when the criminal enters the police station, for instance. There too, we want to think about the fact that policing in the period of slavery is also something that where the police are harnessed as surrogates of the slave owners. And what I mean by that is in British Quebec, the sheriff was a glorified colonial administrator, but his hands were all over slavery. One way is that, for instance, he was in charge of the executioner, who he deemed and other officials deemed that it was necessary that the executioner be a Black enslaved male, because they thought that job was beneath a good white person, a white free person. So they literally, in different periods of New France and Quebec, went to the colonies, to the Francophone or Anglophone colonies, and found an enslaved Black man and brought him back here and forced him to be the executioner. And the sheriff was in charge of him. Another way is that when someone would go bankrupt, the sheriff actually had to take their estate and divvy up the estate to the people who were owed, the creditors. If the estate included enslaved people, the sheriff had to seize that enslaved person and decide who that person was given to as payment for debt. You understand? So the office of the sheriff had his hands all over slavery. So it should be no surprise to us today that modern day policing also has to do with anti-Black and anti-Indigenous racism. And then the third, also equally wonderful question, the value of art and visual culture. Okay, so part of it is what I alluded to. There's a 400-year archive of art produced by Europeans and European Americans that is explicitly often pro-slavery or anti-slavery, but also visual culture comes into it because, listen, in a world where as an enslaved person, your life is literally not your own, you're under all of these prohibitions, like across the board, you're not allowed to learn to read and write. You are materially deprived strategically. Like even if you wanted to draw or sculpt, where are you gonna get a pencil from? Where are you gonna get charcoal and a piece of paper from? It's not happening. So, and on top of that, you trying to maintain your African cultural practices. Like I remember how to make a drum. My grandfather told me, I'm gonna try to find some animal skin and a piece of wood. That even is a struggle because again, you're the poorest of the poor of any society. You have no leisure time, strategically so. You're working 6 days a week and your day off, Sunday, is the only day you have to bathe and groom yourself. Any forms of self-care are done on Sunday. So it's not a day off. It's a self-maintenance day. So then what types of art, material culture do the enslaved leave behind? What can they leave behind? And they left behind a lot. But the problem for us as art historians is much of it then was not deemed to be significant enough by white people to be collected and put in museums. So what we're left with today are descriptions, often sadly from white people who saw enslaved people doing things like playing their drum or singing, or a slave woman who had a head wrapping on, a practice from the African West, for instance. And they would describe it to the best of their ability, which is often not very good because it wasn't their culture. And that's what we have to work with now as scholars, sadly. We often do not have the objects, the cultural objects that we know enslaved people were producing. And then the tail end of that, of course, is white people were hoarding culture. So even when Black people, especially into the 19th century, began to say, hey, I'd like to go to your art academy. You know, I'd like to go to the art school in Montreal or Philadelphia or Toronto. There were either de facto or unwritten rules that said Black people not welcome. So it's very rare then, the farther back you go, to find Black artists who could attain training in Western art practices like landscape painting or marble sculpture or oil portraits, painted oil portraits, right? And that only increases the further out of slavery you get when those racial segregation lifts. But it's not that you don't have populations who want to do that, Black populations, but they're prohibited from entering those spaces of art education until very late.
Thank you. I mean, in your work, what you show us is that in addition to the literary side of, let's say, colonial art production and the way in which literature was supportive, well, you know, kind of merged with racial thinking and with generally with racial categorization to kind of support colonial practices and the colonial project. What your work is showing is that you also have this kind of visual component to, you know, to cultural production that did the same kind of thing.
Yes.
So it was colonial art. I mean, it was art in the service of the colony, in service of colonialism, right?
Oh,
and
yeah.
and really, as you demonstrate, in the service of the maintenance of enslavement. So yes, I mean, it's really important to take that into account and trying to understand how that whole system, that whole apparatus, right, of domination was kept in place. It was kept in place by all of those kind of forms of production: literary, visual art production, sculpting, and of course the scientific production, right? You also had all of that support from the scientific apparatus at the time, from the 17th century on, that gave scientific accounts of the human species that made it justifiable for some to say, well, these are inferior human beings whom I can own as property. Yeah, amazing stuff. Well, I think we're running to the end. We've kind of run out of time here. And there was one more question, but I think were there any instances in which African descendants had slaves?
Yes, there are a few, but of course the dominant group of slave owners were white, either European or Euro-American. But here's where Black people start owning enslaved people. Usually they're mixed race people who inherit enslaved people from white fathers. So in cases, if you go back to the beginning of our talk, right, Brian, where I mentioned that rape and sexual predation against women especially, but also against men, is ubiquitous, is everywhere in slavery. When those white slave owning or just other white men have mixed race children with an enslaved woman, sometimes they're like, this is a human, it's my child, I will free them. Often they free them on their deathbed, but they free them, and often the mechanism of the will, they leave the woman and the children property. So in Jamaica, it became normal to leave, especially land in a house. And that's where mixed race women start to rise in Jamaican society in terms of class, because they start to open lodging houses before there's a hotel infrastructure. But how they got the houses and the land was from the white men who took them and forced them to be what we call concubines in the time, right? So they're stealing their domestic and sexual labor, and they kept them in slavery until, again, most of the times they died. Now the children then too, and the women, sometimes they left them their slave holdings too. So then you have mixed race people who own other mixed race people, or people who are so-called fully Black. And they're not, see, here's the thing, sometimes they're great, they're like, I'm gonna free all of you, and sometimes they're just as bad or quite bad, just like white slave owners. But they're still in the system where other white slave owners do not feel that they're fully human, although they're now free and they're property owners. And in a place like Jamaica, the white magistrates, who are all slave owners, got together when they saw that this was happening a lot. And usually, as you can imagine, who's being manumitted or freed? Almost always mixed race women. Why? Because they're the ones being exploited in the households for sex by white men. So they're the ones who, quote unquote, benefit from being manumitted. However, the white British magistrates who are slave owners get together at a certain point in 1700, they say, hold up a second. We're all giving away too much land, property, wealth to these mixed race people. This is going to shift the balance of power in our society. Because before, you'd have all these enslaved so-called fully Black people, you'd have a few free mixed race, usually people, and then you'd have all of these empowered whites. All of a sudden you have an explosion of the mixed race population, many of whom are free. So they actually get together and impose a limit on how much money and land that they can leave their mixed race relatives. Do you get me? They started to police each other to limit how much wealth they could leave to their own mixed race families. This is how much they needed or wanted to control the mixed race and the Black population, and to continue, make sure that slavery continued in a way that most effectively benefited only white people.
Thank you so much, Charmaine. Look, I guess we're going to have to wrap up. There's one more question, but really the time, we're really out of time, and we have to let people go to their next classes if they have them coming up. So look, this was brilliant, and I really appreciate the time and the insight and the attention to detail of your work, of all of your work, and today's discussion. I really appreciate that. I think that's where, you know, we come to we can gain real insights about the past, and of course the relationship between the past and the present by looking at the detail, which is often left out. right? When sometimes we focus too much on the macro and too much on the global. And I think it's important for a topic such as this to also look at the everyday, to also look at the detail, to also look at individuals and how they were affected. That's the work that you're doing. I think it's of great value, and I really appreciate that you shared it with us today. It was a pleasure, an absolute pleasure, and I wish you all the best. Look forward to your work, to your continued work, and to your continued contributions to this topic. And I thank you, and I thank everyone who was in attendance for.
Thank you, Brian. And if I can just say briefly, part of the reason why it was so attractive for me to leave McGill and come to NASCAD is because I was able to launch an institute, as Brian mentioned, for the study of Canadian slavery. And what I'm working on now is trying to have a suite of fellowships that hopefully go from grad students or even upper year undergrad students right to postdocs, meaning people like yourself, Brian, or other scholars or professors, so the student understand what a postdoc is, someone who already has their PhD, and also artists in residence. Because we need to have these conversations and do this research together, because then it will become very generative and productive, right? So what happens when the MA student working on a history thesis on New Brunswick slavery gets to have lunch with a PhD student who's working on PEI slavery? What happens in that conversation that they would not have been able to have otherwise? So I'm saying this too because I'm hoping that your students who are on their way, many of them to university, will keep this in mind. So if they end up going into any fields or specializations that crisscross with Canadian slavery, there's going to be a space for you at our institute in Halifax, okay? So please keep us on your radar. And thank you, Brian, and thank you, Lisa, and thank you to Bruce and Eric as well for all the support for this.
Well, thank you. Just one thing before you go, Charmaine, yeah. Someone wrote in to say that they could sit here all day, and that's how I feel. I feel like I could sit and talk to you all day. It's really been wonderful, that's insightful, so great learning. I appreciate everything that I've learned from you and your dedication to this topic. I look forward to the work that's yet to come. So thanks very much, Charmaine.
So much. Thank you. I appreciate it too. Be well. Thank you, everybody. Thank you.